The fierce winter storm that swept across the small town of Pine Ridge, Montana, was unlike anything the locals had seen in years. Snow whipped through the air, driven by howling winds that seemed to come from every direction at once. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, and the world outside had become a treacherous landscape of white. In the midst of this unforgiving weather, a golden retriever named Freya battled her way through the deepening snowdrifts. Her normally lustrous coat was matted with ice and snow, but her eyes burned with determination. Clutched gently in her mouth was her sick puppy, Max, whose small body shivered uncontrollably against the biting cold. Freya had been a stray for most of her life, wandering the outskirts of Pine Ridge and occasionally venturing into town when hunger drove her to seek out the kindness of strangers. She had given birth to a litter of puppies in an abandoned shed just outside of town a few months ago. Most of the puppies had been adopted by kind-hearted townspeople, but Max, the runt of the litter, had stayed with her. For days, Max had been growing weaker. At first, Freya had hoped it was just a passing illness, but as the hours ticked by and her puppy's condition worsened, she knew she had to find help. The storm had caught her off guard, separating her from her usual haunts and forcing her deep into the pine forest that gave the town its name. Every step was a struggle for Freya. The snow reached up to her chest in some places, and the wind threatened to knock her off her feet. But she pressed on, her maternal instincts driving her forward with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She could feel Max's labored breathing against her muzzle, and it spurred her on even as her own body began to tire. Through the curtain of snow, Freya's keen eyes caught glimpses of the forest around her. The tall pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. In the summer, these woods were alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, but now an eerie silence had descended, broken only by the howling of the wind and the occasional crack of a branch giving way under the weight of the snow. As Freya pushed on, her mind drifted to warmer days. She remembered the feel of the sun on her fur as she played with Max in a meadow not far from here. The memory of his yips of joy as he chased butterflies through the tall grass seemed to warm her from within, giving her the strength to take one more step, and then another. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Freya's pace had slowed considerably, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She knew she couldn't stop, not even for a moment. To rest now would mean certain death for both her and Maximum. The cold had numbed her pores, and each step sent jolts of pain through her body, but still she pressed on. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, Freya's hope began to waver. She had been sure there was a cabin somewhere in these woods, a place where she had seen humans come and go. But in the blinding snow, everything looked the same. Had she made a mistake? Was she leading her precious Max further into danger instead of towards safety? Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a gust of wind parted the veil of snow for a moment, and Freya caught a glimpse of something in the distance. It was faint, barely visible through the storm, but unmistakable, the warm glow of a window. Renewed energy surged through her tired body, and she pushed forward with renewed determination. The cabin belonged to Jack Henderson, a man who had moved to Pine Ridge 5 years ago seeking solitude after a personal tragedy. Freya had seen him occasionally during her wanderings, a tall, bearded figure chopping wood or tending to his small vegetable garden. He had always seemed kind, leaving out scraps of food for the local wildlife and speaking gently to the birds that frequented his bird feeders. As Freya approached the cabin, she could smell the comforting scent of wood smoke. The porch light was on, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. With the last of her strength, Freya let out a series of weak barks, praying that Jack would hear her over the howling wind. Inside the cabin, Jack sat by the fire, a book open on his lap but his mind far away. The storm had brought back memories of another winter, another time when he had felt helpless against the forces of nature. The sound of barking outside barely registered at first, seeming like just another trick of the wind. But as it persisted, Jack's brow furrowed. He set aside his book and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. At first, he saw nothing but white. But then, illuminated by the porch light, he caught sight of a golden shape struggling through the snow. His eyes widened in recognition. It was the stray golden retriever he had seen around town. And in her mouth, Jack's heart leapt into his throat. Without a second thought, he grabbed his heavy winter coat and threw open the door. The wind hit him like a physical force, nearly knocking him back, but he pushed through it, stepping out onto the porch. "Hey there, girl," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Come on, you're almost here. That's it, just a little further." Freya's ears perked up at the sound of Jack's voice. With a final burst of energy, she climbed the steps of the porch, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. Jack knelt down, his hands reaching out to steady her. "Oh my God," he breathed as he took in the sight of the exhausted mother and her sick pup. Without hesitation, he gently took Max from Freya's mouth, cradling the shivering puppy against his chest. "Come on, let's get you both inside and warmed up." As Jack ushered Freya into the warmth of the cabin, closing the door firmly against the storm outside, a sense of relief washed over the exhausted dog. She had done it. She had found help for Maximum. As Jack set about examining the puppy and preparing a warm bed by the fire, Freya allowed herself to collapse onto the rug, her eyes never leaving her pup. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a spark of hope had been kindled. As Jack worked to save Max and care for Freya, none of them could have known that this night would be the beginning of a journey that would change all of their lives forever. The bonds forged in the face of this winter storm would prove to be stronger than any of them could have imagined, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the unbreakable connection between humans and animals. The warmth of Jack's cabin enveloped Freya like a comforting blanket, a stark contrast to the biting cold she had endured for hours. The golden retriever's eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, remained fixed on her puppy, Max, who lay shivering on a soft blanket by the crackling fireplace. Jack moved with purpose, his weathered hands gentle but efficient as he tended to the sick pup. "You're one brave mama," Jack murmured, glancing at Freya as he worked. His voice was gruff but kind, a reflection of the man himself. Jack Henderson had come to Pine Ridge seeking solitude, but in that moment, he was grateful for the company, even if it came in the form of two unexpected canine guests. The cabin was modest but cozy, filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Bookshelves lined the walls, packed with well-worn novels and nature guides. A guitar stood in one corner, gathering dust, a remnant of a life Jack had left behind in Seattle. The soft glow of lamplight cast warm shadows around the room, creating an atmosphere of safety that was at odds with the howling storm outside. As Jack examined Max, his brow furrowed with concern. The puppy's breathing was labored, and his small body burned with fever. Drawing on knowledge from his years as a park ranger, Jack knew he had to act fast to bring the pup's temperature down and combat whatever illness had taken hold. "Hang in there, little guy," he said softly, reaching for his first aid kit. He mixed a solution of water and electrolytes, carefully coaxing Max to drink. Every few minutes, he would glance at Freya, offering reassuring words. "Your mama brought you to the right place. We'll get you feeling better in no time." Freya watched every move Jack made, her trust in this human growing with each gentle touch and kind word. Despite her own exhaustion, she refused to rest, her maternal instincts keeping her alert and watchful. Jack noticed her vigilance and smiled softly. "You must be hungry," he said, moving to the small kitchen area. He rummaged through his cupboards, emerging with a can of chicken soup. As he heated it on the stove, the savory aroma filled the cabin, causing Freya's stomach to rumble loudly. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. Jack poured the warm soup into a bowl and placed it near Freya. "Go on, girl. You need to keep your strength up." At first, Freya hesitated, her eyes darting between the food and Maximum. But Jack's gentle encouragement and the enticing smell eventually won out. She began to eat, her tail wagging slightly for the first time since arriving at the cabin. As the night wore on, Jack continued to care for Max, applying cool compresses to bring down his fever and administering small doses of puppy-safe medication he found in his well-stocked first aid kit. Freya remained close by, occasionally nuzzling Max or licking his fur, her presence a constant comfort to her sick pup. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. The wind howled through the trees, and snow continued to fall heavily. Jack knew that they were in for a long night, and possibly several days, before they could safely leave the cabin. He made a mental inventory of his supplies, grateful for his habit of always being prepared for extended periods of isolation. As he worked, Jack found himself talking to Freya and Max, filling the cabin with the sound of his voice, something he hadn't done in years. He told them about his life in Seattle, about the family he had lost, and about his decision to seek solitude in the Montana wilderness. There was something cathartic about sharing his story with these two souls who had quite literally blown into his life. "You know," he said, scratching Freya behind the ears, "I came out here to be alone. Thought it was what I needed after everything. But having you two here, it reminds me of what it's like to care for someone else. To have a purpose beyond just existing." Freya listened intently, her brown eyes fixed on Jack's face. Though she couldn't understand his words, she sensed the emotion behind them. She leaned into his touch, offering what comfort she could. As the hours ticked by, Max's condition began to improve. His breathing became more regular, and his fever started to break. Jack allowed himself a small smile of relief. "Looks like we're not out of the woods yet, but your little guy is a fighter," he told Freya. With Max stable for the moment, Jack turned his attention to making the cabin more comfortable for his guests. He fashioned a makeshift bed for Freya near the fire, using old blankets and pillows. Though she was reluctant to leave Max's side, Jack gently coaxed her onto the soft nest. "You need to rest too, Mama. I'll keep an eye on Max, I promise." His voice was soft but firm, and Freya finally relented, curling up on the blankets with a deep sigh. As Freya drifted off to sleep, Jack settled into his armchair, keeping a watchful eye on both dogs. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a sense of peace had settled. Jack found himself reflecting on the strange turn of events that had brought these two into his life. For years, he had convinced himself that solitude was the answer to his pain. After losing his wife and daughter in a car accident, he had retreated from the world, unable to bear the sympathetic looks and well-meaning but painful condolences. Pine Ridge had seemed like the perfect escape, a place where he could be anonymous, where he could hide from his grief. But as he watched Freya and Max, Jack began to realize that perhaps he had been running from the wrong things. The love between the mother dog and her pup, their resilience in the face of adversity, and the trust they had placed in him, it all stirred something in Jack that he thought had died years ago. As the night deepened, Jack found himself dozing off, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the steady breathing of his canine guests. His dreams, for the first time in years, were not haunted by loss and regret. Instead, he dreamed of new beginnings, of second chances. The next morning dawned grey and cold, the storm still swirling outside. Jack woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Then he remembered Freya and Maximum. He looked around quickly, relief washing over him as he saw them both still sleeping peacefully. Max looked better, his breathing easier and his body relaxed. Jack moved quietly, not wanting to disturb them. He stoked the fire and began preparing breakfast, the familiar routine grounding him in the strange new reality of having company. As the smell of coffee and bacon filled the cabin, Freya stirred, her nose twitching at the enticing aromas. "Good morning, girl," Jack said softly as Freya padded over to him, her tail wagging hesitantly. "Let's check on your pup, shall we?" Together, they approached Maximum. The puppy opened his eyes as they neared, letting out a small whimper that quickly turned into a wagging tail when he saw his mother. Freya nuzzled him gently, her whole body relaxing as she saw that he was improving. Jack knelt down, carefully examining Maximum. "Well, look at you, buddy. You're looking much better today." He glanced at Freya, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Your mama knew exactly what she was doing when she brought you here." As Jack prepared food for all of them, oatmeal for himself, some softened kibble he found in his pantry for Freya, and a mixture of puppy formula and soft food for Max, he found himself talking again, filling the cabin with plans for the day. "We'll need to keep an eye on Max, make sure he keeps improving. And once this storm lets up, we'll need to get you both to a vet for a proper checkup." He paused, realizing he was already thinking beyond the immediate future. "But for now, we're stuck here together. Might as well make the best of it, right?" Freya wagged her tail in response, and even Max let out a small, happy yip. As they ate their breakfast, the storm still raging outside, Jack felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in years, his cabin in the woods didn't feel like a hideout. It felt like a home. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to Jack's cabin in the woods. The storm raged on outside, blanketing the world in white and effectively cutting them off from the rest of Pine Ridge. But inside, a different kind of change was taking place, one that was reshaping the lives of both man and dogs in unexpected ways. Jack fell into a routine of caring for Max and Freya, his days now filled with purpose. He'd wake early, stoke the fire, and prepare breakfast for all three of them. Max was growing stronger each day, his appetite returning and his playful nature beginning to shine through. Freya, too, was transforming. The wary stray was slowly giving way to a trusting companion, her eyes following Jack with growing affection. "You're looking better every day, little guy," Jack said one morning as he checked Max over. The puppy wagged his tail, attempting to lick Jack's face. "Hey now, save some of that love for your mama," he laughed, glancing at Freya, who watched the interaction with what Jack could swear was a doggy smile. As Max's health improved, Jack found himself opening up more. He'd talk to the dogs as he went about his daily chores, sharing stories of his life before Pine Ridge. He told them about his job as a software engineer in Seattle, about the house he'd shared with his wife Sarah and their daughter Emily. His voice would sometimes catch when he spoke of them, the pain still raw even after 5 years. "You know," he said one evening as they all sat by the fire, Max curled up in Freya's warm fur, "I used to think that shutting myself away up here was the answer. That if I could just be alone, the pain would go away." He reached out to scratch behind Freya's ears, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting to both of them. "But having you two here, it's made me realize how much I've been missing." Freya lifted her head, her brown eyes meeting Jack's. There was an understanding in her gaze that went beyond words. She, too, had known loneliness and hardship. In Jack, she had found not just help for Max, but a kindred spirit. As the days passed, the cabin began to change. Jack dug out old toys that had been packed away, a soft ball that Max loved to chase, a rope toy that led to playful tug-of-war games. The sound of laughter, both human and canine, filled the spaces that had for so long been silent. One afternoon, as a rare patch of sunlight broke through the clouds, Jack decided it was time for Max to get some fresh air. He bundled up the puppy in an old sweater, chuckling at the sight. "You look ridiculous, buddy, but we've got to keep you warm." Freya watched anxiously as Jack carried Max to the porch, but her worry turned to joy as she saw her pup's excitement at the new sights and smells. They stood there together, Jack, Freya, and Max, watching the snow-covered landscape glisten in the sunlight. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jack murmured. "You know, I'd almost forgotten how stunning it can be out here. Guess I stopped noticing somewhere along the way." That night, as they settled in by the fire, Jack found himself talking about Sarah and Emily. He told Freya and Max about Sarah's laugh, how it could light up a room. He spoke of Emily's curiosity, how she was always asking questions, always wanting to learn more about the world around her. "They would have loved you too," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah always wanted a dog, but with our busy lives in the city, we always said someday. He paused, lost in thought. "I guess I'm learning that someday can sneak up on you when you least expect it." As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Jack, Freya, and Max grew stronger. Jack found himself looking forward to each day, wondering what new adventure it might bring. Max was now fully recovered, his energy seemingly boundless as he romped around the cabin. Freya, too, had blossomed. The timid stray was now confident and affectionate, her tail wagging happily whenever Jack entered the room. One evening, as a particularly fierce gust of wind rattled the windows, Jack realized something. "You know," he said, looking at Freya and Max who were curled up together on their bed by the fire, "I haven't thought about leaving this cabin once since you two arrived. Usually, by now, I'd be going stir-crazy, itching to get back to town." He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Guess you two make for pretty good company." The storm finally began to ease, and Jack knew it was time to think about the future. He'd grown attached to Freya and Max, the thought of parting with them causing an ache in his chest he hadn't felt in years. But he also knew that they deserved more than a life of isolation in his cabin. One morning, as they sat on the porch watching the sun rise over the snow-covered pines, Jack made a decision. "What do you say we take a trip into town today?" he asked, scratching Freya behind the ears. "Think it's about time we got Max here checked out by a proper vet. And maybe we could see about making this arrangement a bit more permanent." Freya's tail wagged at the excitement in Jack's voice, even if she didn't understand the words. Max, now strong enough to explore the porch on his own, yipped happily. As Jack prepared for their journey, packing supplies and ensuring both dogs were warm enough for the trip, he felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer just existing, going through the motions of life. For the first time since losing Sarah and Emily, he was looking forward to the future. The drive into Pine Ridge was slow going, the road still partially covered in snow. Jack's old truck chugged along steadily, Freya sitting in the passenger seat with Max securely in her lap. As they approached the town, Jack felt a moment of anxiety. He had become something of a recluse over the years, his interactions with the townspeople limited to necessary supply runs. But as they pulled up to the small veterinary clinic on Main Street, Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself. "All right, gang," he said, glancing at Freya and Maximum. "Let's do this." Dr. Lisa Chen, the town's veterinarian, was surprised to see Jack Henderson walk through her door, even more so when she saw the two dogs with him. "Well, this is unexpected," she said with a warm smile. "What brings you in today, Jack?" As Jack explained the situation, finding Freya and Max in the storm, nursing them back to health, he saw something in Dr. Chen's eyes. It wasn't the pity he had grown to dread from others. Instead, it was a look of admiration and something else, hope. "You've done a wonderful job with them, Jack," Dr. Chen said after examining Maximum. "This little guy is the picture of health now. And Freya," she added, patting the golden retriever's head, "she's clearly found a place where she feels safe and loved." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "Yeah, well, they've done a lot for me too," he admitted. As they were preparing to leave, Dr. Chen hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You know, Jack, the shelter's been looking for foster homes for dogs. Someone with your experience and obvious love for animals, you'd be perfect." Jack was taken aback. "I don't know. I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility." Dr. Chen smiled knowingly. "Seems to me like you've already taken it on. Just think about it, okay?" As they drove back to the cabin, Jack's mind was whirling with possibilities. The idea of fostering dogs, of opening his home and his heart to more animals in need, it both terrified and excited him. Looking at Freya and Max, now sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat, Jack realized something. These two had done more than just bring noise and activity back into his life. They had brought hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still room in his heart for love. Hope that the future could hold more than just surviving, but truly living. As the cabin came into view, Jack made another decision. Tomorrow, he would go back into town. He would talk to Dr. Chen about fostering. He would buy some paint and start fixing up the guest room that had been closed off for so long. Because Freya and Max weren't just visitors anymore. They were family. And family, Jack was starting to remember, was worth opening your heart for, no matter how much it might hurt. As they settled back into the cabin that night, the fire crackling merrily and the wind whistling outside, Jack felt a peace he hadn't known in years. "Welcome home," he said softly to Freya and Maximum. And for the first time in a long time, he truly meant it. The morning dawned crisp and clear, a welcome change from the weeks of stormy weather. Jack stood on the porch of his cabin, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand, watching as the first rays of sunlight painted the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. Inside, he could hear the soft padding of paws and the occasional jingle of the new collars he had bought for Freya and Maximum. "Today's the big day," Jack said, more to himself than to the dogs. They were heading back into town for Max's follow-up appointment with Dr. Chen. But this trip felt different from their first visit. This time, Jack wasn't just taking in a sick stray and her pup. He was bringing in family. As Jack packed the truck with supplies for the journey, his mind wandered to the changes of the past few weeks. The cabin, once a retreat from the world, now felt alive with the sounds of barking, playing, and yes, even the occasional accident as Max was still learning the finer points of house training. Jack found he didn't mind the mess. Each muddy paw print and chewed shoelace was a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. "All right, gang," Jack called out, opening the cabin door. Time to hit the road. Freya trotted out first, her golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. She had filled out nicely since her arrival, no longer the skinny stray but a healthy, happy dog. Max bounded after her, all gangly legs and floppy ears. He had grown considerably, though he still had a way to go before reaching Freya's size. Getting the dogs into the truck was an adventure in itself. Max, excited by the prospect of a car ride, kept trying to climb into the front seat. "Oh no you don't, buddy," Jack laughed, gently guiding the puppy to the back seat where he had set up a cozy area with blankets and toys. "You're riding in the back with your mom." Freya, ever the protective mother, kept a watchful eye on Max as Jack secured them both. Once everyone was settled, Jack climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and began the drive down the winding road that led from his secluded cabin to the town of Pine Ridge. As they drove, Jack found himself pointing out landmarks to his canine companions. "See that big oak tree? That's where I saw my first bald eagle after moving here," he said, glancing in the rearview mirror to see Max with his head out the window, tongue lolling in the breeze. Freya sat more sedately, but her eyes were alert, taking in every detail of the passing scenery. The drive into town was longer than Jack remembered. Had it always taken this long? Or had he simply gotten used to the isolation of his cabin? As they approached the outskirts of Pine Ridge, Jack felt a familiar tightness in his chest. It had been years since he'd spent any real time in town, preferring to make quick supply runs and then retreat back to his solitude. But as they drove down Main Street, Jack was surprised to find the anxiety lessening. The town hadn't changed much in the years since he'd withdrawn from society. The same old buildings lined the street, their facades freshly painted for the new year. People walked along the sidewalks, bundled up against the cold but smiling and waving to each other. As Jack parked in front of the veterinary clinic, he took a deep breath. "Okay, folks," he said, turning to look at Freya and Maximum. "Let's go see the doc." Dr. Chen greeted them warmly as they entered the clinic. "Well, if it isn't my favorite new family," she said with a smile. "How's everyone doing?" Jack found himself smiling back, a genuine warmth in his voice as he replied, "We're doing great, Doc. Max here is growing like a weed, and Freya, well, she's been a godsend." As Dr. Chen examined Max, checking his weight and overall health, she chatted easily with Jack. "You know, I have to say, Jack, it's good to see you in town more often. People have been asking about you." Jack felt a twinge of guilt at her words. He had shut himself off from the community for so long, convinced that isolation was the only way to deal with his grief. But now, watching as Max playfully tried to lick Dr. Chen's face during the examination, he realized how much he had been missing. "I've been thinking about what you said last time," Jack said hesitantly. "About fostering." Dr. Chen's eyes lit up. "Really? That's wonderful, Jack. We're always in need of good foster homes, especially for older dogs or those with special needs." As they discussed the possibilities, Jack felt a sense of purpose growing within him. The idea of opening his home to more dogs in need, of giving them the same chance at happiness that Freya and Max had found, filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. After the appointment, as Jack was preparing to leave, Dr. Chen handed him a flyer. "We're having a community picnic next weekend to raise funds for the shelter. Why don't you come? Bring Freya and Maximum. It'll be a great chance for them to socialize, and for you to meet some of the other dog lovers in town." Jack hesitated for a moment, old habits of avoidance warring with his new desire for connection. But one look at Freya and Max's eager faces made the decision for him. "We'll be there," he said, surprising himself with how much he was looking forward to it. As they left the clinic, Jack decided to take a detour before heading back to the cabin. He drove to the local pet store, a place he had only visited sporadically in the past for basic supplies. Now, he found himself wandering the aisles with newfound interest, picking out toys for Max, a soft new bed for Freya, and even a book on dog training. The cashier, a young woman named Amy, smiled as she rang up his purchases. "Looks like someone's got some lucky pups," she said. Jack chuckled. "I think I'm the lucky one, actually," he replied, realizing how true the words were as he said them. As they drove back to the cabin, the truck now filled with their new purchases, Jack felt a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead still held challenges, integrating more fully into the community, possibly fostering more dogs, continuing to heal from his past losses. But for the first time in a long time, Jack was looking forward to facing those challenges. Back at the cabin, as Jack unloaded their haul and watched Freya and Max explore their new toys, he made a decision. He walked to the rarely used phone in the kitchen and dialed a number he knew by heart but hadn't called in years. "Hey, Tom," he said when his old friend answered. "It's Jack. I was wondering, would you like to come visit for a few days? There's some people I'd like you to meet." As he hung up the phone, promises of a visit soon in the works, Jack looked at Freya and Max, now curled up together on their new bed. "What do you think, guys? Ready for some more company?" Freya's tail thumped against the floor, and Max let out a small, happy yip. Jack smiled, feeling more at peace than he had in years. The journey to the vet had been about more than just a checkup. It had been a step back into the world, a world that, Jack was beginning to remember, could be full of joy and connection. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jack sat on the porch with Freya and Max by his side. The future, once a source of dread and anxiety, now seemed full of possibility. And as he scratched behind Freya's ears and watched Max chase a butterfly across the yard, Jack knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't be facing them alone. The day of Tom's arrival dawned bright and clear, a perfect Montana morning. Jack was up early, a mixture of excitement and nervousness churning in his stomach. It had been years since he'd seen his old friend, and he wasn't quite sure what to expect. As he went about his morning routine, feeding Freya and Max and tidying up the cabin, he found himself pausing every now and then to stare out the window, watching for the dust cloud that would signal Tom's approach. Freya seemed to sense Jack's anxiety, staying close by his side and occasionally nudging his hand with her nose. Max, oblivious to the impending change, bounced around the cabin with his usual puppy energy, chasing a new toy Jack had bought in anticipation of their guest. "What do you think, girl?" Jack asked Freya as they stood on the porch, the morning sun warming their faces. "Think Tom will like it here?" Freya's tail wagged in response, and Jack couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, I think so too." It was just past noon when the sound of tires on gravel announced Tom's arrival. Jack's heart rate picked up as he watched the unfamiliar rental car make its way up the winding driveway. Freya stood alert at his side, her ears perked forward with interest. Max, hearing the commotion, came bounding out of the cabin, barking excitedly. As the car came to a stop, Jack took a deep breath and stepped off the porch. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Tom. He looked older than Jack remembered, his dark hair now streaked with grey, but his smile was just as warm as ever. "Jack," Tom called out, his voice filled with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "Man, it's good to see you." Before Jack could respond, Tom had crossed the distance between them and pulled him into a bear hug. For a moment, Jack stiffened, unused to such physical contact after years of solitude. But then, almost against his will, he felt himself relax into the embrace, returning it with equal fervor. "It's good to see you too, Tom," Jack said as they pulled apart, surprised to find his voice thick with emotion. Their reunion was interrupted by an insistent barking. Max, unable to contain his excitement any longer, was jumping up and down at their feet, demanding attention. Tom laughed, a deep, hearty sound that seemed to fill the clearing. "And who's this little guy?" he asked, bending down to let Max sniff his hand. "This is Max," Jack said, unable to keep the pride out of his voice. "And that," he added, gesturing to Freya who was watching the proceedings with interest, "is Freya. They're family now." Tom's eyebrows rose at this, but his smile only grew wider. "Well then," he said, reaching out to pat Freya's head, "it's nice to meet you both. I can't wait to hear this story." As they made their way into the cabin, Jack found himself relaxing. He had worried that things would be awkward, that too much time had passed, but Tom's easy manner and genuine interest in his life made it feel as if no time had passed at all. Over cups of strong coffee, Jack filled Tom in on the events of the past few months, finding Freya and Max in the storm, nursing them back to health, and the unexpected way they had changed his life. Tom listened intently, his expression a mixture of surprise and something Jack couldn't quite identify. Was it relief? "I've got to say, Jack," Tom said as Jack finished his story, When you called out of the blue like that, I didn't know what to expect. But this," he gestured around the cabin, at Freya dozing by the fire and Max playing with a chew toy at their feet, "this is amazing. I haven't seen you this alive in years." Jack felt a lump form in his throat at Tom's words. "Yeah, well," he said, trying to keep his voice light, "turns out all I needed was a couple of four-legged roommates to get me out of my funk." Tom's expression turned serious. "Jack," he said, leaning forward, "I know the past few years have been tough. After Sarah and Emily, well, we were all worried about you. When you moved out here, cut yourself off from everyone, I thought we'd lost you for good." Jack looked down at his coffee cup, unable to meet Tom's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I didn't know how to deal with it all. It seemed easier to just disappear." "Hey," Tom said, reaching out to clasp Jack's shoulder, "you don't have to apologize. Grief does funny things to a person. I'm just glad you're finding your way back." As the day wore on, Jack found himself opening up more and more. He and Tom reminisced about old times, sharing stories and laughing in a way Jack hadn't done in years. They took Freya and Max for a walk in the woods, Tom marveling at the beauty of the Montana wilderness. "I can see why you fell in love with this place," Tom said as they stood atop a small hill, looking out over the vast expanse of forest and mountains. "It's breathtaking." Jack nodded, feeling a swell of pride in his adopted home. "It is," he agreed. "But you know, I think I forgot how to really see it for a while there. It took these two," he gestured to Freya and Max, who were playfully chasing each other through the snow, "to remind me how beautiful it all is." That evening, as they sat around the fireplace, bellies full from the hearty stew Jack had prepared, Tom broached a subject Jack had been half expecting, half dreading. "So," Tom said, his tone casual but his eyes serious, "have you given any thought to coming back to Seattle? Even just for a visit? Everyone misses you, you know." Jack was quiet for a long moment, absently scratching behind Freya's ears as he considered his response. A year ago, even a month ago, the mere thought of returning to Seattle would have sent him into a panic. But now, "You know," he said slowly, "I think I might be ready for that. Not to move back," he added quickly, seeing the hope flare in Tom's eyes, "but a visit. Yeah, I think I could do that." Tom's face broke into a wide grin. "That's great, Jack. Really great. And hey, maybe you could bring Freya and Max along. I'm sure everyone would love to meet them." The idea of bringing his dogs to Seattle, of introducing them to his old friends and family, of showing them the life he'd left behind, it was both terrifying and exhilarating. But as Jack looked at Freya and Max, he felt a surge of confidence. With them by his side, he could face anything. "Yeah," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "I think they'd like that." As the night grew late and they prepared for bed, Tom in the guest room that had stood empty for so long, Jack found himself reflecting on the day. The anxiety he'd felt that morning seemed like a distant memory. Having Tom here, reconnecting with his old friend, it felt right. Lying in bed, Freya curled up at his feet and Max in his new bed nearby, Jack felt a sense of peace wash over him. The future, which had for so long seemed like a bleak and lonely road, now held the promise of new adventures, of of growth. As he drifted off to sleep, Jack's last thoughts were of gratitude. Gratitude for the storm that had brought Freya and Max into his life, for the strength he'd found within himself to open his heart again, and for friends like Tom who hadn't given up on him, even when he'd given up on himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new steps on his journey of healing. But for now, in this moment, Jack Henderson was content. He was home, he was surrounded by love, and for the first time in years, he was looking forward to what the future might bring. The weeks following Tom's visit brought a whirlwind of change to Jack's once quiet life in the Montana wilderness. The cabin, which had for so long been a retreat from the world, was now a hub of activity and plans for the future. Jack found himself embracing this new chapter with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. One sunny morning, Jack sat on the porch with his coffee, watching Freya and Max play in the yard. The scene before him was so different from the solitary mornings he'd grown accustomed to over the years. The sound of barking and playful growls filled the air, a constant reminder of the joy these two dogs had brought into his life. "What do you think, guys?" Jack called out to them. Ready for some new adventures? Freya paused in her game of tug-of-war with Max, her tail wagging as she looked at Jack. Even Max, still very much a puppy, seemed to sense the excitement in Jack's voice. He bounded over to the porch, placing his paws on Jack's knees and looking up with those big, brown eyes that never failed to melt Jack's heart. Jack had made some big decisions in the past few days. After long conversations with Tom and several phone calls with old friends back in Seattle, he had decided to take a trip back to his old hometown. But this wouldn't be just any visit. He was planning to bring Freya and Max along, to introduce them to the life and people he'd left behind years ago. The prospect of returning to Seattle was both exhilarating and terrifying. Jack knew that going back would mean facing memories of Sarah and Emily, confronting the grief he'd tried so hard to run from. But he also knew that he was stronger now, better equipped to handle the emotions that would inevitably surface. As he prepared for the trip, Jack found himself opening up more to the community of Pine Ridge. He'd started volunteering at the local animal shelter, inspired by his experience with Freya and Maximum. The townsfolk, who had long viewed Jack as something of a recluse, were pleasantly surprised by his newfound openness and engagement. Dr. Chen, in particular, had become a good friend. She'd been thrilled when Jack had told her about his plans to visit Seattle. "It's a big step, Jack," she'd said, her eyes warm with understanding. "But I think it's a good one. And having Freya and Max with you, well, they're the best support system you could ask for." The day before their departure, Jack decided to take Freya and Max on one last hike through the woods surrounding the cabin. As they walked familiar trails, Jack found himself talking to the dogs, something that had become a habit over the past months. "You know, when I first moved out here, I thought I was leaving everything behind," he said, pausing to watch a deer bound away through the trees. "I thought I could just forget. But that's not how it works, is it?" Freya looked up at him, her expression seeming to say she understood perfectly. Max, less attuned to the seriousness of the moment, was busy chasing a butterfly. "You two taught me that it's okay to remember, to feel," Jack continued. "Sarah and Emily, they'll always be a part of me. And now, so will you." That evening, as Jack packed the last of their things into the truck, he felt a sense of anticipation building. This wasn't just a trip, it was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. He'd already spoken with his old company in Seattle about possibly doing some remote work. The idea of balancing his love for the Montana wilderness with reconnecting to his old life was appealing. As the sun set on their last night in the cabin before the trip, Jack, Freya, and Max sat on the porch, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Jack found himself looking forward to the changing seasons in a way he hadn't in years. "Tomorrow's the big day," he said, scratching behind Freya's ears. "You two ready for a road trip?" Freya's tail thumped against the porch boards, and Max let out an excited yip. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and Jack felt a smile spread across his face. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for starting their journey. Jack loaded the last of their bags into the truck, double-checking that he had everything they might need for the dogs during the long drive. As he locked up the cabin, Jack felt a momentary pang of sadness. This place had been his sanctuary for so long. But as he turned to see Freya and Max waiting patiently by the truck, tails wagging in anticipation, he knew that home wasn't just a place. It was wherever they were together. The drive to Seattle was long but filled with new experiences for all of them. Max, who had never been on such a long car ride, alternated between excited observation of the passing scenery and naps curled up next to Freya. They stopped frequently, letting the dogs stretch their legs and explore new smells at rest stops along the way. As they crossed the state line into Washington, Jack felt his heart rate pick up. They were getting close now. He reached over to pat Freya's head, drawing comfort from her steady presence. "Almost there, girl," he said softly. "Ready to see where I used to live?" The Seattle skyline appeared on the horizon, a sight Jack hadn't seen in years. As they drove into the city, memories flooded back, both happy and painful. But instead of the overwhelming grief he had expected, Jack found himself able to smile at the good memories, to appreciate the life he had shared with Sarah and Emily without being consumed by the loss. They pulled up in front of Tom's house, where they would be staying for the duration of their visit. Tom was waiting on the porch, a broad grin on his face as he watched Jack help Freya and Max out of the truck. "Welcome back, stranger," Tom called out, coming down to greet them. "And welcome to Seattle, you too," he added, bending down to greet the dogs. Over the next few days, Jack reintroduced himself to the city he had once called home. He took Freya and Max to all his old favorite spots, the dog-friendly park where he and Sarah used to have picnics, the beach where Emily had taken her first steps. Each place held memories, but now, with Freya and Max by his side, Jack found he could face them with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. He reconnected with old friends, introducing them to the dogs who had changed his life. Everyone was struck by the change in Jack, the smile that came more easily, the light that had returned to his eyes. One evening, as they sat in Tom's backyard, watching Freya and Max play with Tom's kids, Jack's sister Rebecca turned to him with tears in her eyes. "I've missed you, Jack," she said softly. "We all have. I'm so glad you're here." Jack felt his own eyes well up as he pulled his sister into a hug. "I've missed you too," he said. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long." As their visit drew to a close, Jack found himself feeling conflicted. Part of him had fallen in love with Seattle all over again, appreciating the vibrancy of the city and the warmth of his friends and family. But he also missed the quiet of his cabin, the majesty of the Montana wilderness. On their last night in Seattle, Jack sat on Tom's porch, Freya and Max dozing at his feet. Tom joined him, handing him a beer as he sat down. "So," Tom said, "what's next for you guys?" Jack took a sip of his beer, considering the question. "You know," he said slowly, "I think we're going to head back to Montana. But," he added, seeing the disappointment flash across Tom's face, "I'm not disappearing again. I'm thinking of splitting my time, maybe spend summers in Montana and winters here in Seattle. Best of both worlds, you know?" Tom's face broke into a grin. "That sounds perfect, Jack. And hey, maybe I'll come visit you in Montana sometime. Seems like a pretty special place." As they drove back to Montana a few days later, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The future, which had once seemed like a bleak and lonely road, now held the promise of new adventures, of deepened connections, of a life lived fully. Freya and Max dozed in the backseat, tired out from their big city adventure. Jack glanced at them in the rearview mirror, a warmth spreading through his chest. "We did it, guys," he said softly. "We faced the past, and you know what? The future doesn't seem so scary anymore." As the Montana landscape came into view, Jack felt a sense of homecoming. But this time, it wasn't a retreat from the world. It was a return to a place he loved, with a heart open to all the possibilities that lay ahead. The cabin came into view, familiar and welcoming. But as Jack parked the truck and helped Freya and Max out, he saw it with new eyes. It wasn't just a hideaway anymore. It was a base for new adventures, a place to welcome friends and family, a home filled with love and life. As the sun set on their first day back, Jack sat on the porch with Freya and Max, watching the sky turn to stars. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. And Jack knew, with a certainty that warmed him to his core, that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.